Hi everybody, it's Colleen Doran. Thanks for stopping by this evening. I am working on Neil Gaiman's Snow Glass Apples, and I started this page some time ago, and if you have been watching this channel, you probably saw me work on this for about a half hour and then chuck it. This was the first iteration of this page, and here's the second. You can see that I was drawing this on camera and talking about some of my favorite artists and getting a little distracted, and I wasn't happy with how it was going. You can see that I've completely rethought the drape on the sleeves here, and I've rethought the shape of the candles, the placement of the candles, and I also went back and redrew a good deal of this swirl effect. I'd free-handed most of this and realized later that everything looked kind of lopsided, so I carefully measured it all in, and even so, I made quite a lot of errors in this area. There's a lot of white out in here, and I kept smearing it and having to fix that. One of the great hazards of doing everything by hand, there's no undo button, but Snow Glass Apples is a short story by Neil Gaiman. Now that it's been announced, I can tell you what I was working on. I wasn't able to tell you last time you popped in, and it's a job that I'm being very meticulous about. In fact, almost half the pages on the book were started like this. I'd get to this point, maybe even further along, and then completely chuck it and start all over from scratch. And that's where I am right here on this one, maybe about a third of the way into the job. I'm still not entirely certain what I want to do with some areas of this piece. I'm not certain about the design of these witches here. If you're familiar with the story, this isn't a big pivotal scene, but I did want to do something very decorative and showy for this moment, and I think this pays off. And one of the nice things about it is that a good deal of the labor on this is something that is easy for me to do while I'm talking to you, because it's not exactly rocket science to draw all these little circles. This is a kind of Virgil Finlay effect, instead of just stippling with little bitty dots, to go in and create texture and pattern with little circles. And it is as labor intensive and tedious as it looks. I suppose it's easier to do digitally. I don't like to do a lot of my work digitally. I don't blame anyone who does, but I like the hand of man in my art at all times, even when I do digital art. The underdrawing is usually by hand, and virtually all of the drawing on this book is by hand. Like I said, when I first showed you a video of me working on this piece, quite some time ago, as a matter of fact, I meant to get back to this and talk to you again, but I've been very distracted and wasn't in a good place to be on camera and talk about things. So now I feel like I am, and I'm happy to be here with you this evening. My throat sounds a little dry. You'll have to forgive me if I stop every once in a while and chug a big glug of this iced coffee tumbler. That's quite a cup of grog there. I do love my iced coffee. I drink it all day. I hardly ever drink hot coffee, but I am devoted to iced coffee. I used to drink gallons of Starbucks every week. I'd get the big bottles of Frappuccino, but now I just get the grocery brand coffee, and some local creamery has the best cream ever, and that's all she wrote. I go in there and I drink all that coffee. Keeps me going. Anyway, so last time we did a video together, I was talking with my patrons on Patreon about some of my favorite artists. I love being able to do that. A nice gentleman from Journeyman Studios posted a question to my Patreon, and I'll mention him again. He says, could you discuss your influences, heroes, and the good people, publishers you've met in the industry, and please mention us by name. And here they are, Journeyman Studios. A couple of guys in our 40s trying to get comics and create comics and RPGs. Their Instagram is at instagram.com, journeyman1029 /HL =EN. Occasional nudity and violence at the link. I'll place a link to your page at the bottom of this post as well, so people can go find you if they like. Anyway, I got about a half hour into doing this piece at our last talk, and I didn't like the piece and decided to go ahead and quit. And I was happy to be able to talk to everyone about two of my greatest influences, the illustrators Tasha Tudor and Beatrix Potter. Lovely, lovely women, huge influences on my life and work. When I say life, I'm not kidding. My ultimate goal was to become an artist living out in the country, off the grid, maybe raising some goats and growing all my own food. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I developed an autoimmune disorder and no longer have the physical stamina to do all the things that I used to enjoy. I hope maybe I'll recover or go into remission at some point, but as of now, that's not likely. So my big dream of being like Tasha Tudor and raising goats didn't come true ultimately, even though I was lucky enough to live in the country and garden for the better part of 15 years. But anyway, so we had a nice talk about Tasha Tudor and Beatrix Potter. I admire them immensely. I think they're wonderful examples of living your own life and going your own way. And one of my other great idols is Rose O'Neill. This page over here is one of Rose O'Neill's pieces. She was a suffragette, and she created the Kewpies, the Kewpie dolls, all of that merchandise that you've probably seen in antique shops over old issues of Ladies' Home Journal and so on. She's the creator of the Kewpies, and she was an immensely successful cartoonist and illustrator. Born in 1874, she was one of the highest paid artists in the world at the time. And her creation, the Kewpies, ended up making well over $1 million for her, or more than $30 million adjusted for 2018 dollars. She was brilliant in so many ways. She was not only a cartoonist, she was a fine artist. She was a poet, a novelist. She was a sculptress. She did some beautiful, beautiful monumental sculptures. I'm so impressed with the power, the fundamental, epic power of these pieces, and did a series of drawings that were exhibited in Paris called the Monster Drawings. They're really beautiful and strange and unusual. You can probably find them online. And Rose was an extraordinary, way ahead of her time woman. She is probably the artist I admire most in the world. You can see over here that I have a number of books about her and by her. This is one of her novels, which is quite a mouthful to read. It's written in those old-fashioned styles that are full of adjectives and adverbs. Here's a line from chapter 2. When Aspasia Jane Ross Conant was still of a very tender age, she was known beside her trundle bed to lift up her soul in the following prayer: Dear God, please make me a better child if you possibly can. If not, Never mind, I can get along very well as I am. Now these are words to live by. That's great. And this is probably the best book written about Rose O'Neal. She did do an autobiography. I have a copy of her autobiography, but it's a pretty slim volume. She leaves a lot out. But this book, Titans and Cupies, The Life and Art of Rose O'Neal, is the most comprehensive work that I've been able to find, and I think I have just about every book ever written about Rose O'Neal. This one I got a while back, and whoever owned it, and I think it was a nice lady named Miss B. Smith. Miss B. Smith, you left this photograph of your relatives in here. Grandmother in Gordon in the grounds of the Great Southern Hotel, Gulfport, Mississippi, 1926. If any of your kin ever see this video, please do track me down. I will be happy to return to you your family photo. This was signed by the author, the director of the Foster Museum Rose O'Neal collection, a number of other people who were apparently members of this Rose O'Neal fan group. And here's a little cocktail napkin from the Branson, Missouri meeting of the Blue Wingers. I love this. I'm going to keep this for you, your family, Miss B. Smith. You ever track me down? It's right here. Anyway, so this is probably the best book. It had a lot of stuff I didn't know about it about Rose O'Neal until I read it. It was very, very interesting. And here is another book about Rose O'Neal. This one I picked up more than 20 years ago from the Brandywine Museum. This was from an exhibit of Rose O'Neal's work in 1989. It's a lovely little book with some nice photos and reproductions of some of her work. Here's let's see, I think some of her sculptures are back here. They're really impressive. Here she is in one of her outfits. She was a great believer in eschewing the constraints of the corset. And here she is with one of her sculptures, the embrace of the tree. Isn't that amazing? And here, this photo is wonderful. This is Charles Coleman, Callista O'Neal, that's her sister, and Rose at the Villa Narcissa in Capri in 1915. She was extraordinarily wealthy. She had multiple homes, and she was a great hostess. There was a running joke, I'm not sure how true it is, but there was a running joke that if you would come to visit her at one of her homes, people would come to stay for a weekend, and then they'd end up staying for a couple of years. She attracted quite a lot of parasitic people. They drained her finances, and she ended up dying broke. She was extraordinarily generous. I can't find anyone to ever say a bad word about her, except that she had a habit of using baby talk. It's sort of her legend. I think it's an unfair slur that is often traded about her. Her baby talk helped cause her second divorce from the writer and editor Henry Leon Wilson. That's not necessarily very true. This book gets into the details of what actually happened there, but it was a popular rumor that had been spread by some rather uncharitable people, and in part spread by her friend, the writer Booth Tarkington. For those of you who don't know the name Booth Tarkington, you probably know The Magnificent Ambersons, the film by Orson Welles. His great unrealized masterpiece, and I say unrealized because the studio was said to have chopped it up and turned it into something he didn't intend. Booth Tarkington is not so well regarded today as he was in his time. He won many awards, including a couple of Pulitzers, but he's fallen out of fashion. I think it's unfair. I think he's a brilliant writer. He's certainly of his time, but, you know, So's Balzac. Like him too. Anyway, Booth Tarkington wrote quite a number of novels that were set in the 1910s and the 1920s, and a lot of people considered him the great American novelist, better than or as important as Mark Twain. And F. Scott Fitzgerald considered his book 17 to be the funniest book he ever read. He listed it among his 10 favorite books. And the reason why 17 is relevant to Rose O'Neal, the lead female character anyway, of the book is a beautiful, curvaceous stunner who has all the young men of this small town wrapped around a little finger, and she talks a lot of baby talk. And the rumor got around that this character was based on Rose O'Neal. Probably was. The character's pretty irritating. The baby talk affectation is just hard to read, but apparently this was the thing about Rose O'Neal that kind of got up people's nose. In virtually every biography of her, it's mentioned and discussed at some length. Unfairly, I think. I don't know if people go into such a tither over the affectations of the speech patterns of a lot of men artists, but there you have it. I wondered about it a lot myself. I suppose it's kind of weird to be sitting there talking about how did Rose O'Neal use baby talk, but there's a lot that people don't understand about what was going on with Rose O'Neal. She lived an extraordinary life, but she also lived an extraordinarily difficult life. She would say my life wasn't difficult, and then, in a sort of passive way, you could tell that she didn't necessarily mean it when it came out of her mouth. She was the sole breadwinner for not only herself, but her extended family. She had a fairly large family, and she supported her mother, her father, her brothers and sisters, and she was also the sole support of a number of artists. And think about what a burden that must have been for a young woman born in 1874. This was an artist so extraordinarily talented that she was a professional artist and illustrator while still in her teens, before women even had the right to vote. And when Rose was only about 13 or 14, I'm not sure which, the stories vary, she won an art contest, and the judges were so incredulous about the quality of the work that she produced that they asked her to sit down and draw something in front of them before they'd give her the prize. So she was prodigy, and she came from this eccentric family. Her father was a piece of work, and he was hoping to turn her into a star from a very young age. He'd hoped to turn her into an actress, and she did a little bit of acting when she was a very young girl, and in fact got to meet the great stage actor Edwin Booth. I don't think he was too terribly impressed by her talent, but that's extraordinary that she had these opportunities and acquaintances. Regardless of her father's ambitions, she went into the arts instead with the full support of her family, which again was truly extraordinary. This was at a time when women were not even necessarily allowed into art school, and they certainly weren't allowed to work from the nude model. I recall reading in Rose O'Neill's autobiography, how she'd just drop trow in front of a mirror and have a look and draw from what she saw there. She was a very, very beautiful woman. Some accounts say that she was considered one of the most beautiful women of her time, and her photographs are lovely. I suppose it's a little shallow to go on about that as well, but it is relevant to her social status, the way she was treated by people around her, and I think it's probably relevant to her femininity with the baby talk and the flowing garments and the romantic airs that she adopted. I think that the fact that she was such an intelligent, talented, driven woman who had quite a lot of power, I think probably the baby talk affectation was a way of her disarming the people around her a bit, getting them to maybe underestimate her a little bit, or perhaps even maybe take care of her for a change. Here she was in a position of having to take care of all of these people around her. Her brother, whom she loved very, very much, was an extraordinary person with the nickname Clink, and he was mentally disabled. So her deep love for him meant that she would go to any length to provide for his care. So she was not only paying for multiple households, she was also paying for the expensive mental health care that he received. He was repeatedly institutionalized, and what a responsibility for her. What a burden for a young woman, again, before she even had the right to vote. And one of her many burdens was her first husband. Another amazing story about the life of Rose O'Neill. Rose O'Neill met this handsome young Virginian named Gray Latham, and he came from an old school Confederate family, and his father was Major Woodville Latham. His brother was Otway, and they were early developers of the motion picture industry. They were some of the first people to not only film film of a certain length. How do I explain? Okay, back in the day, before digital, you had to film movies on long tape, like a long spool of tape. But back then, the length of that spool had to be limited to about 50 feet because the film couldn't thread through the spools without snapping. And the Lathams came up with this innovation, a new kinetoscope technology called the Latham loop. If you look at old movie projectors, they'll have this little loop in them. And that was their innovation, the Latham loop, and to project images onto screens so that large numbers of people could see instead of just looking in a little bitty box, which is the way films used to be seen. And Gray Latham, who later married Rose, if you go look on IMDb, you can find a few of his early movies. He filmed Prize Fight, and can't remember. not sure. I think it might have been a bullfight or something, but I remember there was definitely a prize fight that he filmed. I can't remember what the other films he did was. Anyway, so unfortunately for the Lathams, they got involved with Edison. And Edison had a reputation for ripping off the people who collaborated with him. And the Lathams ended up getting into all kinds of financial and legal trouble due to this. But make a long story short, for a while, Gray Latham was the talk of the town. He was a dandy. He was making some decent money. And one look at Rose O'Neill, and he was like, "Holy cow! Here's a beauty." They corresponded for a long time, and eventually they got married. I think they knew each other for like 5 years before they got married. Rose used to go back and forth to New York and her family home in the Ozarks, I believe. Anyway, so they got married, and he turned out to be a bit of a bad hat. He was a gambler. He was a ne'er-do-well. He was extraordinarily handsome and decorative, and everybody talked about what a handsome couple they were, but he wasn't a nice person. And one of his rattier habits was going to Rose's publishers and picking up her paychecks and then spending them before she could even get her money. That wasn't good, but believe it or not, this pioneer lady cartoonist, who was probably the world's first full-time professional cartoonist, she was certainly the first full-time professional American woman cartoonist, she ended up being involved romantically with a man who helped develop the film industry. And ain't that weird? Ultimately, Rose O'Neill felt she had no choice but to divorce the fellow. It was a good call. He was, like I said, he was a bit of a bad hat. But you won't find much in her autobiography about him. He gets barely a mention. You will find more in Titans and Cupies, but not a whole lot. There are a few bits in there that you won't find anywhere else. For example, Gray Latham did not live long after his marriage to Rose. I knew he had died young, very young, but I did not know that he'd been murdered. He had gotten into some sort of burlesque shows or something. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up getting involved with some dubious characters, but not long after their divorce, his dead body was found. He'd been beaten to death in an alley in New York. And that was the end of Gray Latham. But I went for years not knowing what happened to Gray Latham, and found it in Titans and Cupies. Pretty sad story. She lived an extraordinary, amazing life. She, like I said, she was a multimillionaire. Way before most women were even allowed to have their own checking accounts. Her Cupies, which she didn't develop until after she divorced Gray Latham, her Cupies were one of the world's first licensed product. It was a worldwide license. She created the franchise and helped create the whole idea of the franchise, the franchised cartoon product. She not only helped to run the business, I believe her sister helped to run that business, but She did the sculptures for the original dolls as well. Very talented sculptress. I just think the world of her sculpting, and completely different than her monumental fine artwork, which just shows her extraordinary range. Anyway, so after her divorce from Gray Latham, she married one of her editors, rather dour individual named Henry Leon Wilson. She and he stayed friends regardless, which is quite nice. But he was sort of a reticent, quiet, scholarly fellow, and she was known for being very girlish and jubilant and full of fun. And opposites attract, but they don't often stay together forever. But to their credit, they stayed good friends their whole life. And as I wrote before, the rumor is that Wilson divorced her because of her baby talk, and it's clear, especially after reading Titans and Cupids, that this is not the case. They just weren't suited for one another, and her baby talk is kind of a mean rumor, but they were friends, lifelong friends, I believe. And when things went really sour for her later in life, I think he helped her out a bit, which was very decent of them both, I think. Anyway, so about Leon Wilson, he was a writer as well, as I mentioned. I think I have a couple of his books around here. And one of his books, which I believe it was Ruggles of Red Gap, ended up being made into an early silent film, which is pretty cool. They traveled around the world. They knew all kinds of interesting people, sculptors, actors, novelists, poets, other artists. They just seemed like terrific cosmopolitan folks. And yet, despite everything, Rose O'Neill would often return to her family home in the Ozarks. And she was very, very devoted to her family, devoted to her brother, devoted to her sister. You can find a lot of her work online. I gotta tell you, it kills me that more people in comics don't talk about Rose O'Neill, don't nominate her for Lifetime Achievement Awards. I don't believe she's ever gotten the posthumous Eisner she clearly deserves. I realize, this is pop culture and people have the memories of mayflies, but criminy, she is seminal. She's the grandmother of women cartoonists. Let's just call it out. She is our queen, and a lot of people don't even know who she is. It drives me nuts. But there you have it. Let me see. Think of a few other tidbits. You may have heard of a song called "The Rose of Washington Square." I've heard it said that is about her. I've heard it said that's a coincidence. I prefer to think it's true because, hey, it's a cool thing to think. I guess we'll never know. She lived in Paris for a while. She took classes from Rodin. Not too shabby. And she exhibited at fine art galleries in New York and in Paris. Cartoonist extraordinaire. I just admire and love her. I admire her not only for her wonderful, wonderful broad talent, but for her beautiful person. She was extraordinarily generous and kind and good to other artists. What is not to love about this woman? She loved other people to her own detriment. She, like I said, she ended up dying virtually penniless. She was constantly giving money away. Cripes. We had to have a little cut there because I live in the country, and whenever there's a storm, we end up losing power. We are not living in the modern age over here, so when and there it goes again. Yeah, the power is just going to blink on and off. You get snow or wind out here, and it's anybody's guess how long you're going to keep the lights on. Fortunately, we do have a generator, but it doesn't cover all of our problems here. You know, the lights go out periodically, and everything has to be reset, and it's kind of a pain in the ass. But sorry about the interruption. I'll try to splice this video together so it doesn't look too bad. Anyway, as I was saying, I greatly admire Rose O'Neal, not just as an artist, but as a person. She was extraordinarily generous, financially and spiritually to other people. Everyone speaks very, very highly of her, and unfortunately for her, she didn't have much instinct for self-preservation. She gave her fortune away. She was so generous to others for so long that at the end of her life she had almost nothing left. She was in reduced circumstances, which is the understatement of the century, and unfortunately things did not get better for her. Not too long after she moved back home to Missouri, she had a stroke or a heart attack and was temporarily paralyzed and then passed away. And her brother, Clink, was living in the house after she died, and he had an accident and left fire burning in the stove, and it burned down the house and took out a lot of Rose O'Neal's things. Before she died, many of her papers and some of her art had been moved off site, so not everything was gone, but a lot of her personal effects, her antiques and so on, ended up being lost for good. Great sadness there for both the family and for art lovers. Her house was reconstructed later. I believe it is on the campus of Drury University. If I'm wrong, I'll put a little note under this video for you to find out where it actually is, but I'm pretty sure that's it. I confess it's a little tricky to talk about these things as well as draw. Try to be articulate and get my work done at the same time. It's not always easy. But I hope you enjoy these little talks that we have here and get a look at snow glass apples tonight. And of course I'll have to splice this video together so you can see everything without the power going out in the middle of the stream. Well, I think we've been chatting and drawing for maybe an hour now. I'm not sure. But I hope you enjoyed this little talk about my idol, Rose O'Neill. I love getting to discuss artists I admire, and Rose O'Neill is at the top of my list. I hope that after this little chat you'll take some time to seek her out. There are events devoted to her, there's a museum devoted to her, there are websites devoted to her, and I hope someday that she'll have the Eisner she deserves. I think it's a pity that someone of her scope, her broad range of talent, her extraordinary contribution to American culture and pop culture in general, her contributions to women's rights and human rights in general, her financial support of other artists. I don't know why she isn't more well regarded in the comics community. I think it's a damn shame. I think it probably has to do with the fact that people in this industry just have really short memories and not much historical context for their beliefs about what's important in comics. Rose O'Neill is important. Check her out. You can find this online. If you are the family of Miss B. Smith and this is your photo, please contact me. I'll be happy to return it. Rose O'Neill, I'm going to get back to working on this. Thanks for stopping in this evening. I'm sorry my throat's a little sore. I'm going to cut this a little bit shorter than I wanted to, but man, do I need to go gargle or something. Anyway, thanks so much this evening. Thank you for supporting me on Patreon. It's always nice to talk with you, and if you're one of my patrons, please do feel free to ask me a question. I'll try to answer them in one of these videos. Thanks again, everybody. I love you guys to death. Thank you so much for supporting my art. And look for Snow Glass Apples by Neil Gaiman, art by me, coming in August from Dark Horse. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.